Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to give folks just a minute to join the meeting. I see the number of attendees climbing as we speak, and I want to give folks a moment so that they are able to log in. We'll get started in just 1 minute. Okay, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time and respectful of the expertise we have here in the meeting. So we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is John Verdi. I am the Senior Vice President at the Future of Privacy Forum, and I could not be happier to welcome everyone to this event, Connecting the Dots on Privacy, Security, and Online Safety for Young People in Australia. We are thrilled to co-host with our friends and partners, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And we're very pleased that this discussion today follows an event last fall where FPF partnered with the University of New South Wales Allens Hub for Technology, Law, and Innovation to discuss crucial issues related to online safety, in particular, young people's safety, privacy, and security. We published a report following that fall convening. And given the recent developments, fast-moving developments in this space when it comes to AI, when it comes to new regulatory and other developments, we thought it would be time to reconvene experts to continue these important conversations. So in the wake of the recent release of industry standards for designated internet services and relevant electronic services, in the wake of the rapidly advancing artificial intelligence tools and systems that are being deployed by organizations in Australia and around the world, we are bringing together a diverse stakeholder group of experts to try to make progress and get greater clarity around some of these very important issues. How best to protect everyone, but especially young people online, how to ensure that young people benefit from private, secure, and safe online experiences, and how to best balance and understand some of the very complicated technical, business practice, and regulatory issues that are in play in this space. So I'm going to move quickly to our agenda. We have a jam-packed agenda of experts from a variety of different sectors, and I will hand things over to Bart, Deputy Director at ASPI and our co-host for this event. Bart, thank you so much for co-hosting, and thank you for joining us this morning, Australia time, and this evening here where I'm at.
Thanks, John, and thanks to everyone joining this morning in Australia, and thanks to the Future Privacy Forum for really initiating this event. We're really happy to partner with you for this. As John mentioned, my name is Bart Hoogeveen. I'm a Deputy Director for Cyber Technology and Security here at ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. So also on behalf of ASPI, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. As some of you may know, ASPI is an independent and non-partisan think tank, and really what we do is to, on areas at this intersection between cyber, tech, and security, to inform policy debate, to make sure we have better policy, better standards, better regulations. Most of that work that we do is informed by our data and evidence-based research. We really intend to inform policy, ensure that government is and is able to make good policy and good policy decisions, and really getting these different voices in the room, different perspectives, we believe is a critical part of that. So we're really happy to be part of this conversation and help facilitate. I'd just like to quickly reflect on an event that happened here in Canberra, from where I'm tuning in today, last night. Where our colleagues of the Australian National University's Tech Policy Design Centre organized an event on the future of technology with lots of members of parliament, parliamentary staffers there, but also they spoke about their views, their opinions about the world of cyber tech, safety, and security. And to me, the common thread across all interventions from the different sides of the house, and regardless of whether they were tech optimists or doom and gloom thinkers, they were saying a couple of things about Australia as a whole. Australia needs to become better at online safety across the board. We need to do a much better job at personal data protection. We also need to have a much more proper critical debate about more or less government intervention, and also about more or less responsibility for industry, for platforms, etc. And what also stood out to me was that we need to make sure that we design an ecosystem of online safety that works for us here, given Australia's historical cultural context, despite many of the platforms coming from overseas, from the US, from China, from Europe. And with that, I would like to also acknowledge that here we stand on the shoulders of centuries of strong culture, tradition, and community, and in ways of dealing with new technologies in an innovative way here in Australia, but I think also as part of the wider region in which we sit. With that, I would like to acknowledge the traditional nations of Australia on whose land we meet today or connecting to virtually, and extend my respect to elders past and present, and acknowledge their custodianship of and for future generations. And I think that ties really nicely into the topic of today's discussion, and I'm really looking forward to it. But I won't be doing that myself. I'd really like to pass the floor to my dear colleague, Mike Bareja, who is also the Deputy Director for Cyber Tech and Security at ASPI, who will moderate the discussion. Mike, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bart. And as Bart mentioned, I'm the moderator for today. What I'm going to do just initially is quickly give some opening remarks, and then I'm going to throw to our five amazing guests, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves, and they've got a question that I'll repeat here as well around a broad issue in this kind of space. But initially, to kind of frame the discussion and the issues today, it's a really crucial area of technology today to talk about privacy, security, and online safety. And we all know that the internet has revolutionized communication and commerce and access to information. And it has posed a critical question, which is how do we ensure a safe online environment without sacrificing the fundamental right to privacy? And sometimes this discussion paints a false dichotomy of prioritizing safety at the expense of privacy. However, I've actually found in Australia, in my experience, we've often, more often than not, moved beyond that crude bipolar approach. And apart from the occasional political stump speech or the front page of a tabloid, most people understand or appreciate the nuances of this issue or the grey areas. And most people understand that privacy isn't a luxury. It's the foundation of a free society. And without it, there's no free expression, no dissent, no ability to explore ideas without fear of judgment. It builds trust online, fostering spaces for collaboration and vulnerable communities and for whistleblowers. Encryption is a really important technology in this space as well, talking about the ability to scramble data and make it unreadable by those that don't want to read it or those that you don't want to read it. It's a technological cornerstone of privacy online. It already protects our financial information, our medical records, our personal communications, and it protects us from criminals, hackers, and even overreaching governments. But we can't be naive at the same time, is that there are significant dangers online on the internet. It needs to be a balance struck, as Bart was mentioning there, in how we address them. We don't want, on the one hand, a digital Wild West where criminals can operate freely and law enforcement loses its valuable investigative tools. The answer lies somewhere in between, somewhere in that space of collaboration. The tech companies as well need robust content moderation systems, working with law enforcement, empowering users as well is really important. How do we educate people to identify and report harmful behavior? And international cooperation is also very important between nations because of the ability to cooperate and track down and stop criminal activity, but also global tech companies working around the world, and we need to be able to work with them. And every country which has its own legislative and regulatory approach needs to work with them as well. So the onus, I think, is on policymakers and on tech companies to find these creative solutions that prioritize or allow both safety and privacy to flourish. So I think today's discussion is a vital step in that direction, and let us not settle for that false bargain, that false dichotomy, and build a secure online future where privacy remains central, but the risk of online harms is also minimized. So with that, I'd like to throw to each of our 5 guests individually, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves and a bit of their background and what they're doing now. And I'll ask an individual question of each of them as well. So first up is Peter Leonard. So could you please introduce yourself? And after you've done that, could you please tell us what kind of future changes or enhancements do you foresee being necessary in Australia's regulatory frameworks to protect young people online?
Thanks, Mike. And that's a big question. I'm going to sort of narrow down and focus on a couple of areas. So I was a big law partner for some decades. So it's always a risk handing me the mic first because you'll never shut me up. But the good news is that I'm recovering from a bad cold, so I don't think my voice is going to last. So you won't have me in the megaphone for too long. Look, I thought, given the range of issues in this space at the moment, I'd really focus in on a couple of areas. And one I wanted to focus on was the so-called basic online safety expectations under the Online Safety Act. And the reason I want to focus on that is that I think it's a really good illustration of Australia's willingness to take different and perhaps unique approaches to regulation in this space. The bos, a bit like the Australian platypus and other Australian native animals, is a bit odd and arguably unique globally. And I say that because it is neither legally enforceable of itself, nor part of the Act itself, but rather in a delegated instrument under the Act, which effectively, well, it's partly in the Act and partly delegated, but the delegated bit can be expanded and changed by ministerial determination, and was quite significantly changed in May of this year. And I just want to really highlight that change and where it might go next. So what the BOS do, the Basic Online Safety Expectations, is require affected service providers to respond to requests from the e-Safety Commissioner to report as to the reasonable steps that they are taking to ensure safe use of their services. And the BOS say that in ensuring safe use, they should assess and mitigate the adverse effect of business decisions on the ability of end users to use the services in a safe manner. And that reflects an Australian approach, really, that the Online Safety Act was a pioneer in, but which is now being picked up in other Australian statutes, such as the proposed privacy reforms, of really focusing on organisational accountability rather than notice and consent of affected individuals, and also requiring implementation of a risk of harms assessment and mitigation approach. And for an example of how it works, in January of this year, eSafety published a report on that followed a reporting notice they'd given to Twitter as to the steps that Twitter was taking to enforce its hateful conduct policy, as well as reviewing the impact of Twitter's reductions in staffing. And that report noted that Twitter had an 80% reduction in engineers focused on trust and safety issues globally, following Twitter's acquisition by Elon Musk in October 2022. The number of staff went down from 279 globally to 55, and that reduction coincided with a 75% increase in Twitter's median time to respond to user requests to address hateful conduct in direct messages, and 20% for tweets. So the BOS, as amended, now provides that a provider of an online service likely to be accessed by children, and note that that's not just social media services, potentially including a very broad range of online services, will take reasonable steps to ensure that the best interests of the child, and defined in this Act as somebody under 18 years of age, are a primary consideration in the design and operation of that service. And the standard and threshold of likely to be assessed by children is intended to align to the UK Information Commissioner's age-appropriate design code, thus, so the government, making it simpler for services to assess to what extent the obligation applies to them. So in other words, here's a framework that says that service providers should proactively assess the likelihood their service is to be accessed by children and not disregard this expectation on the ground that their service is not explicitly targeted at children, and that the regulation then gives examples of reasonable steps that should be taken and provides, as I say, for a reporting framework. Now, currently under review by the independent review of the eSafety Act as whether the BOS should become directly enforceable by eSafety, not just a reporting mechanism with associated name and shame, and whether there should be a new statutory duty of care on providers of online services towards their users. And that might in turn lead to calls for a direct cause of action, a little like the current proposal of the government to include a direct right of action by individuals in respect of breaches of the Privacy Act. So that is a very significant area for change. And I'll just briefly mention, because I'm conscious of time, that we will no doubt get on to the issue of age assurance. And I can't hand the microphone over without noting that the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, has said that the coalition, the opposition in Australia, would ban under 16s from social media within 100 days should they win the next election, and that this comment elicited significant support across the political divide and therefore has quite some momentum in Australia, notwithstanding the eSafety Commissioner herself expressing some significant reservations with this approach. And maybe we can deal with that later in the discussion. Thanks,
Yes,
Mark.
thanks, Peter. That's two things there I just grabbed onto, but that organizational accountability increase is something that I've noted globally. There's been this, what I've called a regulatory reversal trend, where we're seeing much more onus being put onto the providers rather than having a risk-based user beware model. And just there where you said around the age access to social media, it's also something that Albanese has announced a 6.5 million pilot to test various tech for age verification. But we will get to that. So thank you, Peter. Next up, we have Lizzie O'Shea. So Lizzie O'Shea, could you please introduce yourself, and what does a human rights perspective help us improve, or how does a human rights perspective help us improve online safety for young people?
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to speak today, and thanks to ASPI and also the Future of Privacy Forum for hosting this webinar. I think it's very timely, and this is an issue that requires considered and careful discussion and debate, and isn't perhaps well suited to the political cycle. So I think there's a real role to play for people who are experts in relevant fields to contribute to this discussion, and this is an example of that, in my opinion, that's very welcome. So I wanted to start by saying that my day job is that I am a litigator and I sue tech companies that have done the wrong thing. And I do that on behalf of people who've been harmed. But I'm here in my capacity as the founder and the chair of Digital Rights Watch. Digital Rights Watch seeks to advocate for human rights in online spaces, and we do that in a variety of formats through making policy submissions, through campaigning work, and through public education work. We have had a big focus on privacy in recent times because, as people may know, related to this discussion, there is privacy reform on the table. A bill is due to be tabled in August in that respect, but we've obviously also had a great interest in the online safety regime. And in essence, our key argument is that human rights needs to be at the centre of online safety regulation. And I say that because I understand, as all human rights practitioners do, that many rights are not absolute. It's only a very few number that are. But interferences with rights, when they are justified, need to have a legitimate purpose, need to be appropriately limited. And there's ways in which, therefore, in a human rights regime, there's capacity to negotiate around what these kinds of compromises look like, and to do that in a transparent and accountable way. So I think privacy is absolutely central to online safety. I also accept, as I'm sure many privacy advocates do, that there may be legitimate reasons for interfering with privacy, but I think a mature policy discussion requires that we understand when that occurs, that there be a legitimate purpose, that it's appropriately limited, and that people have the opportunity to comment on that. And so that's the basis of arguing that human rights has a really important role to play, and it is a useful tool for working out how best to make policy when it comes to online safety. So to that end, we've been critical at times of the development of the online safety regime in Australia, mainly on a few different grounds. But the first one is that I think there are significant powers that are afforded to the e-Safety Commissioner, and not often with, I think, sufficient transparency around how they're used. We think complaints regimes that are set out in the Online Safety Act have a very important role to play. But when then it comes to proactively asking industry to moderate content in the name of protecting online safety, I think there is a concern around the abrogation of democratic rulemaking, transparency and accountability, and the fear that people at the margins might suffer the consequences or negative consequences associated with these regimes, might have their rights interfered with in ways that aren't properly accommodated by the regime. I'm also a bit concerned, and I think many advocates are, around the use of the classification regime as the framework for developing online safety, which is not always it's not always suitable for the task at hand. The classification regime was developed with an understanding of it being used on cultural material, content that's developed as part of our culture, not necessarily regulating the internet at large. So there's a concern that this needs to be updated, and I think that's a valid one, to be responsive to the challenges posed in the 21st century, particularly for young people, but for all people online. There is a real concern around the tendency, not just under the online safety regime, but more generally, to advocate for widespread interventions into this space that involve interferences with rights without necessarily considering more limited interventions. So age assurance, I'm sure we'll talk about at some point in this discussion, but it's a good example. It's been put forward as a method for dealing with things like access to gambling by young people or pornography in circumstances where there may be alternative regimes that could do the same job and not result in interferences with people's privacy generally that comes with these age assurance schemes. And I would just note, for example, that there is a proposed ban on online gambling advertising and advertising and gambling in general, which has widespread political support, but that's not being pursued as an alternative to, for example, age assurance for accessing these kinds of websites. So this, unfortunately, I think becomes a highly politicised issue where best practice in terms of policy making is not followed. And I think that human rights framing allows us to understand when that might be occurring and intervene in ways that keep a focus on the needs of individuals when going online to make sure their safety is protected, but also with appropriate limitations on the powers of regulators and proposals that are put forward to ensure that those rights remain protected. I'd be interested in talking a little bit more about some of these other topics as we get to them, particularly around the expansive powers of the online safety regulator. But for now, at least, that's where I wanted to start, around that human rights framing.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. That's a fascinating view on this, especially where you were saying there around that highly politicized nature of it doesn't lead to good evidence-based policy or best practice policy. It sounds like a similar situation to what we've had for a long time in illicit drug policy, which has been highly politicized and hasn't been very well evidence-based and data-based policy for that area either.
I should say, Mike, I was
Sorry.
pretty impressed by your optimism at the start of this webinar. I don't know if other panelists may agree, but I thought you were very optimistic about the way in which privacy features in this discussion. I wish it was more central, but I'd be interested to know if other panelists agree with that.
Well, it's,
I wish
yeah,
I could share
I probably lean on the pro-privacy side, but yeah, we can get to that. Amber Hawkes is up next, and could you please introduce yourself and maybe tell us, how can technology companies innovate and improve their services while ensuring they adhere to privacy and security standards for young people?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Also, thanks so much for the opportunity for being able to share. I too am just actually thankful, in fact, going to some of what Lizzie said and what's been said already, for the opportunity to be at a webinar or in a panel with privacy, security and safety people on it all at the same time. So this is not something that actually I often find that we're segregated in our responses. And so I'm really grateful for that opportunity, actually. And I think that this is a great opportunity for us to bring all of those things together. And as you said at the beginning, Mike, there is a general understanding, I think, that these things are not necessarily always in conflict, but sometimes we do speak about them in silos. So this is a great thing. So my background actually is more on the safety side. I've spent most of my career working to protect women and children from violence, originally as a lawyer. Started off in the online space working with well, the first crossover with the online space was working for the Commonwealth DPP, prosecuting cases of online child sexual exploitation. And then I founded the Australian arm of a global not-for-profit international justice mission, which works to protect the poor from violence by building capacity into justice systems, including working on cases of online child exploitation, particularly live streaming sexual abuse. Then I switched over into the tech sector and had some experience working with Meta, leading their safety policy for the Asia Pacific region, working with regulators around the region, attempting to form helpful online safety regulation and inputting expert advice back into product development. And now I consult to both NGOs and technology companies alike. So that's where I come from in this. And I guess I would start actually with the same premise that Lizzie had in relation to how technology companies should design to ensure they're protecting the security and privacy of kids, and that is with a human rights-based approach. So I think when a technology company is actually looking to the experience that it wants to provide its users, it has an idea usually of what that experience should be like. If that service is likely to be accessed by children, the company should really be thinking about what that experience is that it wants to provide for children, but then look at that with a child rights within a child rights framework. So within that experience, how should that company and how should that product and service then optimize the enjoyment of rights for that child? And I think, we see with the Convention on the Rights of the Child and General Comment 25 that we have this laid out, like what are sort of the digital rights for the child. And we have the concept of the best interests of the child, which actually applies when these rights are our intention. It's not something that comes first, it's something that comes second. So when we have we have rights to privacy, participation and enjoyment online, and also the right to protection from abuse and exploitation and violence. So we have all of these rights. The question is what kind of impact assessment can be done on that product for those rights to be optimized. That should be the starting point. In order to do that, a company has to do a risk assessment for the functionality of its product. Now, the features that it builds, whatever it happens to do in relation to that product, will necessarily differ from one product to the other, because there can't be a prescriptive list for all products that won't actually keep up with innovation and won't actually keep up with the technology companies. So I feel that the obligation needs to be on companies to do that impact assessment, to undertake that risk assessment, and to have a duty to be continuously monitoring that and updating the functionality due to that. In line with that, there needs to be an element leading back into regulation. There needs to be, an element of transparency and access to data as well, because we need to be able to hold the companies to account that that's actually what they're doing. And as we have those levers of transparency, that allows regulators and others to learn what are the mitigations that they've been developing, what are the new innovations. Because I think the issue that we run into, of course, that we all know in this area, is that governments, regulators, they don't have as much technology expertise as the companies. And that's what makes this a really tricky space to regulate. Will they ever be able to have that much expertise? And how do we create a system where they have that kind of knowledge sharing and access to be able to hold companies to account is a key question. And I guess I just finish on the fact that I think these areas of privacy and safety, we need to continue to get to a point where we acknowledge that they're not always in conflict. And if we start from a design approach, then we'll see that they're not. So I'll just take a current example. One of the safety issues that we're most concerned about in Australia, but around the world at the moment, is the sexual extortion of kids, and particularly young males, online. And this is run by organised criminals out of Nigeria in particular, not only. And it's leading to all kinds of tragic outcomes and even death among this group of people who are targeted. Companies could go for an option of detection in relation to those kind of offences. And, once the cat's out of the bag, there's a question of whether they should as well. However, one thing we do know about that kind of offence is the organised criminals, one of the ways that they operate is to threaten to send sexual images that they've gathered, that they've extracted from the young person, to all of their lists of known contacts, and they somehow have information on their friends and information on who they could send it to. The question is why, if privacy of those kids had been at the forefront to begin with, would their followers lists and friends lists be public at this moment? And the same goes for grooming and for other child sexual exploitation offences. It's the discoverability of these kids and the connectivity between certain individuals that becomes part of the problem. And the question is, what is being done more for these connections rather than to detect the harmful content? And so I think I'm just trying to give you a couple of examples there about where privacy and safety features are actually not in conflict. And I'm happy to see everyone sitting around the table, because I believe that all of us here want kids to be safe. And if we can work towards those solutions, that's the best thing that we could do.
And I think you were hinting there as well, one of the issues to address is the changing nature of privacy, the changing expectations of privacy, which may not be the same through generations, for example. Thank you, Amber. Next up, we have Dr. Susan Lloyd-Jones, and your question would be, what are the main challenges faced by regulators in keeping up with the rapidly evolving digital landscape? So more about the technology and what's the new challenges it's throwing up, and it may be around a big one, which is, say, Gen AI and the issues there.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And hello to those of you who I already know from other things, Lizzie, Peter. So I am a cybersecurity law and policy postdoctoral researcher in the Faculty of Law and Justice at UNSW. And I come to this discussion of, more from the security side, because I focus on not only cybersecurity, but critical infrastructure regulation, and the impact of emerging and critical technologies in that space. So way more infrastructural in a way, and a bit more in the security side. But the research that I do speaks to privacy and safety and some of the issues that we're talking about today, and that the other speakers have already raised. And I have a background in government as well. So I was at the ACMA for over a decade. I've worked in industry, in complex complex industry environments. So I worked for Foxtel, and I've also been in legal practice. So that's sort of my circuitous route into this area. And so thinking about the challenges faced by regulators like the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner in keeping up with this rapidly changing environment, I'm going to zoom out because I like the big picture, and I like to look at the sort of the trends of things and the kind of the bigger forces that regulators have to grapple with as they do their work, and actually governments as well. And it's not unique to Australia. The whole world is doing it. So the first challenge is complexity. The complexity of the E-Safety Commissioner's operating environment. The evolving digital landscape is a complex system, and it's well known and studied that the more complex the system, the more difficult it is to regulate. And this is because complex systems are usually dynamic, and they interact with other systems. And so there are these interdependencies and other factors operating. And so that's always really clear in critical infrastructure. But you can see how we've got different systems operating in this environment as well. There's what the Safety Commissioner does, but there's what the federal police do. There's what our security services want, and some where they start to converge and become complex and interdependent. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is this global regulatory environment in which the Commissioner and other regulators have to operate, but they're bounded by the jurisdiction and the powers that they're granted in their jurisdiction. And so even though, we do have conflict of laws and, long-arm jurisdiction and all those things, and Lizzie will know more about that than me, but I think, the stoush with Elon Musk kind of shows you how it's a global operating environment, except that, the powers only go so far, and then a testing happens in a state court. And I think that was actually an important test of those powers and of its reach. And we'll probably cover that a bit more too. The third challenge is gaps in the gaps that emerging technology causes in regulatory frameworks and powers. And it's also a gap in skills. And Amber, I think you raised that about, who has got the skills and the knowledge to be able to deal with, the first two challenges of complexity and the global operating environment, but also to the technology itself, the emerging technology. And so, evolving and emerging disruptive technologies like AI, generative AI, machine learning, but eventually, technologies in the pipeline like quantum computing, quantum AI, they're going to leave many regulatory concepts and constructs behind. And we see this happening in the Telecommunications Act, in the Telecommunications Interception and Access Act, but even concepts which are key in the Online Safety Act, like technical feasibility. I mean, emerging technologies can actually render concepts like that they can either break them or strain them. And the ACMA did some work back in 2015 about broken concepts. And so it's worth, revisiting some of that earlier work that's been done, which dealt with technological change and how it impacted regulatory frameworks. My fourth challenge is the difficult resourcing choices that the e-safety commissioner must make, and other regulators and law enforcement and security have to make the same decisions. And that's about where to deploy her limited resources, because she can't go after everyone and everything. And I was recently at a symposium where, or I listened to a speaker from the AFP who was talking about how and Hayden, you'll be able to talk about this too, is, the goal is, protecting real children. But then you have AI, generative AI, which is producing, child abuse material. And so it's, again, how do you make those choices, in that environment? And protecting real children is really the key. The final, or not my final challenge, but the fifth challenge is temporal. That's the when to intervene question, not the how to intervene. And again, emerging technologies always bring up these issues of, when a technology becomes mainstream, sometimes it's too late to actually regulate it or change it by design. And so how do you get in at the early stages? And the final challenge is what I perceive as a regulatory convergence between privacy, safety, and security. And I think this seminar actually is indicative of that. But it also creates another problem of, where does safety end and security begin? And where does privacy sort of sit within that in the regulatory environment, which is still very much a siloed environment in terms of, we've got a privacy regulator, we've got an online safety regulator, we've got a critical infrastructure regulator, we've got different things. So that's my 2 cents worth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Significant challenges there that you've outlined, and I recognize all of them. The temporal one you mentioned there is sometimes also expressed in a operational, if you will, way, where there's conflict between different parties that are seeking to stop a bad thing happening versus investigating and tracing the source of this activity, and a classic kind of law enforcement versus intelligence paradigm. Which brings me to our final but not least guest of which is Detective Acting Superintendent Hayden Wells. Today, your question after you introduce yourself is, what is law enforcement's role in online safety? Something we haven't mentioned very much as of yet. And how has that changed over the last 10 years when there's been so much change in technology?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I haven't had a chance to test my microphone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, perfect. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to be able to join this panel discussion. Certainly interesting, and appreciate the panelists giving some insights here. And I've made some notes here, so hopefully we can have a bit of a further conversation about it. But yes, my name's Hayden Wells. I work for the Australian Federal Police. I'm currently a Detective Acting Superintendent. My role is I oversee the operational arm of the ACE, which is the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation, and we're lucky enough to be up in Brisbane, so we have a nice mild winter at the moment, so apologies to anyone in the southern states. My background, I've been a detective in both state and federal over the past 30 years, and I now specialise in investigations into online child sexual exploitation. And the question Mike's asked is, I guess it adds a bit of a different take on some of the other questions, but and I'm trying to work from where I can answer it from. And I guess I am going to be speaking from the law enforcement side of the equation, where that offending has already happened, has already occurred, and irrespective of privacy and security, safety considerations, and the regulation in the industry and industry compliance and tech compliance as we get these new codes that come in. So I thought I would answer it in talk a little bit about what we do in the child protection space, and it has been a journey over I'd say the past 14 years, and certainly over the past 5 years, which saw the creation of the ACE building, as we call it, and the ACE function in 2018. So essentially, the ACE is a coordination centre, and it brings together a global effort. And I say global because it incorporates the acknowledgement that we can't do this alone, policing can't do this alone, and there is that saying that we can't arrest our way out of the problem. So I guess the best way to describe what we do is as a coordination centre, we are the front door to the reports of child sexual exploitation that come in internationally, primarily through our NECMEC partner, which is the National Centre of Missing and Exploited Children in the United States. And it's an interesting dynamic when we consider the regulation in privacy and security that we're looking to implement in Australia now, when we are implementing, is the mandatory compliance for those massive social media companies such as Meta, who have to report those instances of child abuse and child exploitation through to the NECMEC NGO, and their role is they collect those reports and they send them out globally. And so our role here at the ACE is to be that front door, receive those reports. And my teams here, we receive them, we triage those reports, we prioritise them, we add value through our intelligence cells, we can do some investigations, further targeted development, and we can utilise some of the other investigative bodies such as the COVID Online Engagement Unit, and of course primarily use our victim identification unit to be able to identify these children victims and remove them from harm. So the foundation of the ACE back in 2018 for the government at the time was a recognition, and I guess this is my point as to where we've made change, is the recognition of the need to bring everyone together. And starting off small, and working with global partners, sure, but domestic and our federal policing agencies and our state and territory policing agencies receiving these NECMEC reports. We start off small, and then the acknowledgement that we need to be working and bringing more into the fold, and to see that development over the past 10 years, where we are now incorporating law enforcement, international and domestic, our government, Five Eyes, our other international partners, in Australia, our government agencies, our NGOs, academia, civil society, bringing everyone together to work together rather in a siloed environment. And along with that goes the regulation and the privacy and security developments in the background. And certainly Dr. Lloyd mentioned about the impacts of some of these technologies such as AI and end-to-end encryption. And we can't do this alone as a policing agency, so we need to draw on those experts. I just wanted to touch on in regards to the role of law enforcement that I've certainly seen change over that 10 years, and that is that we need to have included an education and prevention piece. We need to arm our kids, our parents, with those knowledge and that skill set to be able to keep themselves safe. It's great that we have the broader initiatives, but at the end of the day, it's the child sitting in a bedroom on a device that we need to be able to get that information to. And part of the ACE is one of the initiatives was to develop the online child safety team. And you may have heard of Think You Know initiative. It's a development that's been a program that's been running for 14 years. And it's about to go through a refresh and relaunch. But the goal of the Think You Know program and the online child safety team is to get out into the community and pass the messages on, given these skill sets to parents, to educators, to law enforcement agencies, to forearm our children to get them ahead of the offending, if that makes sense. And I think that's significantly one of the changes I've seen, in particular my short time here with the ACE. I've been here 3 years now, but the education aspect and the need or the acceptance and the appetite to continue to add layer upon layer of team members and our partners and our stakeholders into the ACE. And we've now broadened that to where we are working with all the government bodies, but also in industry and private industries such as banking institutes who are now working and embedded here in the ACE as well. So I guess in answering that second part of the question, Mike, is that would be the change, is the acceptance that policing can't do this on their own, bringing everyone together. And I think we're in really good stead to move forward, and certainly welcome to have it to talk about some of those other impacts of technology impacting law enforcement, such as AI and end-to-end encryption. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Hayden. And that education piece you mentioned there is just so important. It's not unique to this space either. It works in so many different areas in our communities where, cybersecurity definitely is a very related area. But when we think about something like health, most people's health outcomes are going to be determined by their own actions and by their own understanding of risk. And so that education and the ability to have informed population is really important. So thanks everyone for those opening remarks. We're going to throw it open to a bit of a discussion now, and I might voluntold Lizzie actually, but one of the things that Lizzie raised, and it was kind of common across a lot of people's statements, was that the legislation or the powers are somewhat vague and maybe in requiring some kind of clarification or even toning down. So Lizzie, what would you say to the e-safety commissioner if you had an audience with her saying, this is how you need to change what you're doing?
Well, the first thing I would say is that she has a difficult but very important job. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I think particularly after the intervention, they're seeking to remove or restrict access to content through the federal court against X. She's copped a lot of abuse, which I think is completely wrong. And I think it's fair to call that out and acknowledge that she's got a very tricky job. What I would say is that case is instructive. I just wanted to read a comment made by the judge in rejecting the extension that she sought for the injunction around restricting that content. People might remember it was the video of a stabbing that took place in a church in Sydney, which was classified as a terrorist event. And what the judge said is that there is widespread alarm at the prospect of a decision by an official of a national government restricting access to controversial material on the internet by people all over the world. And what he said is that if such a capacity existed, it might be used for a variety of regimes for a variety of purposes, not all of which would be benign. And I think that's worth stating at the outset. There was a lot of discussion at the time the Online Safety Act was introduced that these might be powers that aren't necessarily going to be used. And my view about laws like that is you shouldn't have laws that are very expansive. They should be tailored for the purpose that they're stated to be introduced for. And I think that is a problem. The powers that exist for the E-Safety Commissioner are very broad. That I think there is invariably a lack of transparency in how they're exercised, in part because a lot of this regulation occurs in partnership with industry. It's very resource intensive developing these kinds of codes. We, as one of the few digital rights organisations in the country, don't have the capacity or ways to engage with them at the level we would like. And as a result, there tends to be a very cooperative relationship with lots of members of industry, with the exception, I think, quite starkly, of the X case. Sorry, you can probably hear my very retro grandfather clock ticking over, and I apologise for that. I do like old forms of technology as well as new ones. But what I would say about that is that I think in those circumstances, we have to focus on transparency. We have to focus on limiting the powers of the Commissioner, or at least the exercise of them. And we have to be very concerned around when such proposals for use of those powers start to infringe on other people's rights, firstly in relation to privacy, but also, what was just mentioned was the role of end-to-end encryption. We've been extremely concerned about the potential for, under an e-safety rubric, the weakening or undermining of end-to-end encryption, which is relied on by everybody who uses the internet almost on a daily basis. So, that kind of intervention, if we use the human rights framework that I discussed earlier, we would say, is it legitimate to interfere or undermine end-to-end encryption, which is essential for a safe internet, essential for an internet that values democracy? in order to serve a particular safety purpose? And are there other interventions we could use instead? And how can it be appropriately limited? In the case of encryption, I think it's almost impossible for it to be appropriately limited. And I really welcome the comments and the recent industry code that was handed down by the Commissioner, which did, I think, step back from what looked like it was going to be an interference with or an undermining of end-to-end encryption. And I thought that was the right move by the eSafety Commissioner, and I applaud her for that. But these kinds of discussions have happened in a highly charged political environment where the safety objective is used to justify undermining the rights of many, many people and very expansionist powers that in other circumstances, like the judge observed in the federal court, we'd be very alarmed if this occurred in an authoritarian regime. We'd be very alarmed if it occurred in a comparative liberal democracy. So that, I think, is why I keep returning to this human rights lens. What are these proposals? Is it tailored and appropriate for the purposes it's stated? And can it be limited? If it can be, is it being limited? And that's just not what we're seeing in this space, unfortunately. But I do think there's now a trend, it seems, in the right direction with the recent comments by the eSafety Commissioner and the recent code that was handed down.
And I want to encourage all of our guests to jump in at any time to comment. But this kind of encryption war has been going on for many, many years, many decades, and it sort of has an issue that prompts the front page again around, oh, here's why we need to have these backdoors or these kinds of discussions. But are there any other guests who would like to comment on that, about the role of encryption or the changing expectations of privacy and how encryption can support them?
I'll have a go if I can. I mean, I think all of the speakers, I think, have made various references to the need to balance safety, security, and privacy, and bring the human rights perspective to the discussion. And encryption, of course, is the classic example of that, the balance of the right to communicate in private with issues as to, amongst other things, safety and national security. And that is a particularly difficult balance to get right. There is a danger always that politicians like to establish schemes which give very broad discretions to regulators so that the politicians can then complain when the regulators don't exercise the powers in the way that they like, and it removes their personal responsibility from getting the regulation right in the first place. And again, in defence of the eSafety Commissioner, I'd like to note that she has strongly pushed back on this suggestion that people under the age of 16 should be banned from access to social media, noting, amongst other things, that demonises social media as a particular form of online interaction subject to higher risk, which it isn't necessarily. And secondly, that many teens gain important information through social media interactions, and indeed often use social media as the means to protect against vulnerability. So it does work both ways. So, look, I think it is a risk that a regulator is given very broad discretions, but sometimes, careful what you wish for. Politicians can be much more knee-jerk and simplistic in their solutions. You can develop a much more nuanced approach through regulatory intervention, but that in turn carries the risk, as Lizzie rightly identifies, that industry is much better resourced to engage with the kind of detailed interaction that regulators seek, rightly, in the development of regulatory policy, and that leaves consumer groups and other less resourced organisations with lesser ability to engage in and influence those processes. So it is a very difficult balance to get right.
Mike, I can jump in just about end-to-end encryption. I mean, the thing about encryption is it drives the digital economy. So it's, it underpins so much of how things work, you know, banking, financing, banking and finance, our communications, you know, we can see it in cybersecurity. It's really important for, you know, ensuring and protecting networks. So it's got a wider life than just, you know, a messaging app. So that's on the one hand why, you know, not breaking it is really important. But on the other hand, I feel quite confident that there are researchers and technologists, you know, in this country and elsewhere who will be able to solve that problem in the sense of being able to, you know, create technologies that can accommodate privacy, personal privacy, communication privacy, but also allow the arms of government or the you know the police or security to be able to access the information that they need and that they're lawfully able to obtain, you know, within their you know regulatory frameworks that they operate in. So, you know, I think that there's already, you know, research going on which is looking at, you know, different ways of communicating information where not everything is communicated or only certain things are. And, you know, there are ways to, I think that there are ways to do that. So that's the first thing, is a kind of confidence in it. And the second thing about encryption is, you know, whether we like it or not, it is facing significant challenges because of emerging technology, which is in the pipeline. Now, you know, that technology may be sort of 5 to 10 years away, and I'm talking about quantum computing. But, you know, there is a real identified, you know, risk that, you know, that an error-corrected quantum computer will be able to break public key encryption, which is, of course, what pretty much everything you know, what all of our messaging uses. Obviously, different kinds of encryption operates in different places, but, you know, that's the big one. That's the public-facing one. And so, you know, technology is always evolving, and I just think it's imperative that we continue to fund the research, you know, to find the solutions, but also recognise how important it is for other things. And I think even the e-safety commissioner, just on the young people point, you know, I think she released research yesterday which said that certain communities really benefit from having access to, you know, online communications and being able to speak in safe places. And encryption does make spaces safe as well as dangerous. So it's always got that double edge. And that's, yep, thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, this encryption argument could take us all the way to the end of the session, I think. And as just been put in the chat, Maggie from the e-safety team saying that the e-safety position in relation to end-to-end encryption has been clear during the whole process. We do not require breaking or weakening of encryption. The standards now provide greater clarity, as noted. These are issues that aren't going away on encryption specifically, and we had James Comey from the FBI going way back in 2014 saying that they're going dark then, and we've had Mike Burgess from ASIO in Australia saying that just recently again, and I'm sure Hayden would have a lot to say on that, but I don't want to put us down into this rabbit hole of encryption. There's so much more to talk about, and one of those things that that Hayden actually raised was that education piece and that kind of awareness raising. So my question, I guess, to everyone is what kind of digital literacy education do we need to push in schools or outside of schools for everyone in the community to help raise awareness of these e-safety issues? And I think another thing is the awareness of the regulatory framework and how it works, because I think that that's a real dark area for most people as well. How do we go about that education?
I can maybe jump in first. I've got a few thoughts. So I think one of the things that we need to do, first of all, in relation to any kind of education is ask the kids what works. And so any kind of design needs to factor in what they say. And I know eSafety has done a lot of research in that regard, and there are many researchers who are asking youth what it is that works for them. And I think that that's critical. I think maybe we should do some work asking parents what works for them as well, in terms of what they need. Or a bit more work in that regard, because it is tricky for parents. I think in relation to schools, one of the things I know for my kids, I have 3 of them, and what happens with online safety education is a lot of the time it is segmented in what's like, you know, one period where they talk about how to stay safe online, and then they might do it a few times. And I realise that there are a lot of things kids have to learn under the curriculum, but I wonder if there needs to be a more integrated approach with talking about the online world and its integration across all of the subjects, across all of our work, like to understand how these things integrate with their life and what they do. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing that is underdone personally is education done by tech companies themselves. And so I think, you know, Hayden, I think, or someone was mentioning, like, you know, we want them to be safe, but they're already there staring at their device. They are already there staring at their device. And so what is on their device telling them how to be safe is a key question. And so when there's functionality, and look, a lot of the products do integrate various educational screens and pop-ups at different times. I will say that a lot of that is deeply embedded in like menu after menu, or if something happens to happen and a kid was looking for something, then that or a default was turned off, then that education might pop up. I think personally that could be done better, and it could be more at the forefront of kids' experience that's built into their user experience of products. And then, you know, we do have people like, we have the AFP and many organisations funding campaigns, and those campaigns are on social media, but actually integrating it into product and expecting tech companies to do a better job of it, I think would be a good start.
I would just jump in
sorry, go
to
on.
say the only other thing that comes to mind in the context of this discussion is that we have a lot of opinions about how young people should use social media, for example, or certainly politicians seem to. And yet we often send them to school where they're subjected to all sorts of technology that watches what they do all the time. And that causes parents a huge amount of concern, in at least among our membership base. So the role of EdTech, I think, needs to be discussed in this context. Like, what are we teaching children when there's all sorts of technical devices that surveil how they engage with their education, that it's okay to be surveilled and for that data to be used, and it ought to be better regulated, and there's some work being done on this. That does lead me to just mention quickly that the Privacy Act, obviously one of the recommendations around its review that I'm sure everyone in this room is aware of, is the development of a children's privacy code. I think there is a strong argument, for example, that should prohibit any kind of targeted advertising of children, which I think would assist with kind of some of the worst excesses of the business model, data extractive business models that underpin platforms that many children engage in. I personally think targeted advertising prohibitions should be broader than just children, but I think it's a very important starting point. It's worth considering that, like, you know, how can we then, when they're on a platform, target the business model that often leads to very negative outcomes for young people, negative outcomes in terms of how they feel about themselves, perhaps how they're, you know, engaging in the democratic space. So there's lots of ways in which I think we can shape the structures that they engage with in digital life that can contribute, or at least support, or at least not undermine some of those education interventions that you were discussing, Amber.
And
Can I say something on that, Mike?
Yeah, of course. I was just going to, before you do that, I was going to say we've got a couple of questions, and I encourage all participants to post questions if you have them, and we can address them as well. Go on, Peter.
Look, I was just going to say that educational initiatives should start in the home, recognising that the problem often occurs within the home. And I sometimes think that there is an abnegation of responsibility by parents and transfer of responsibility either to the schools or to indeed anyone else to create the right environment, access the right tools, ensure children are given appropriate direction and advice. And I think the E-Safety Commissioner has devoted significant resource to providing materials and assistance to parents in that process. So I think it's important. There is also the risk that many people come back to saying the tech platform should do more, and they become an easy political whipping boy in this process as well. There are certain things that they can do, and certainly some can significantly improve their online design and associated tools and instructional materials to reduce online safety risks. And I do think the privacy reforms, including a positive requirement that services directed at children take into account the best interests of the child. I think they're very important reforms as well. But it really was to say that we shouldn't pass the buck back to the tech platforms. They have an important role to play, but this will begin and end at home. Thank you.
Yeah, Mike, can I make a comment to you? So a big theme in my work in critical infrastructure and cybersecurity is resilience. And so, resilient systems and a system being able to bounce back. And I think that from an adverse event. And I think that applies here as well, because the interesting thing about resilience is that it's not fear-based. And I think, approaching young people's online experiences or regulating it through a fear-based lens is actually not good for them and not good for resilience. It's not good for anybody. So I think building resilience rather than scaring is a key theme. And the way resilience is built is through skills, building skills and knowing how to be in the environment. And I guess I look at the school environment, and that's a great opportunity for skills and resilience to be engendered in children, and that's through teachers getting good training, maybe having compulsory training, where it's a compulsory professional development that they have to do, cyber awareness, or not even just cyber, but safety awareness. There's those things, and that may well be the case. That's not my area, but that's what I think of. I'm often thinking about resilience. How can we build resilience, bring down the fear, even though fear is a good motivator. But really it's about resilience, about surviving, because the technology will continue to evolve. It's not going away. Innovations will still happen. We think generative AI is bad. So that sounded fear-based.
And we're using that that resilience concept as well, much more now applied to populations and to things like democratic institutions. What are the resilience of these to mis and disinformation? What are the resilience characteristics of social cohesion in the face of mis and disinformation? One thing that had come up earlier was the age verification proposals, and we've got a question there as well. Been following closely age assurance in the US and in Europe. What role do efforts on age assurance play in the conversations in this panel today, and how does it implicate equities on safety, security, and privacy in the Australian context? And just for everyone, just to reiterate, we had the opposition leader Peter Dutton say that they would institute an age limit, no one under 16 for social media in the first 100 days of office if they were to win. And at the same time, in May, Prime Minister Albanese has announced I think it was a $6 million pilot of technology to test the feasibility of age verification.
Can I? Yeah, I'll I don't mind going first on this one. I think it stems from the resilience question as well. So particularly in relation to trying to ban under 16s will not prepare anybody to use social media well, necessarily. And so and I think we have to face the fact that, you know, youth themselves are saying that they are not particularly keen on it. And in general, some surveys that have been done, they are, you know, believe that they'll find ways to get around it anyway. And so what happens then? And so I think there are a couple of concerns. I'll get to the equities, but one of the concerns then is if we're putting requirements on companies, for example, social media companies, to institute some kind of age assurance or age verification, do they then get a free pass for the safety of people between 16 and 18 years old or 16 to 24 years old? What kind of, you know, foot sort of comes off the accelerator, so to speak, with other safety interventions then, if they can, you know, we've sort of seen this in the past, if we say that, you know, that they might be able to say, well, we don't have under 13s on our platforms, or because we're not tracking it, so therefore we don't design it for under 13s. There are various ramifications of taking these approaches, basically. Then it comes down to how effective is that age mechanism and what are the equities involved. And I think there's certainly evidence at the moment that it's not as effective as it needs to be. Even if you did agree with the use of using facial features for age estimation, for example, which has some very big problems with it for many principled reasons. Even if you did, the technology is not sort of there yet as far as how accurate it is, and in also what it's trained on. We think about First Nations populations and people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and whether this kind of technology would actually fairly apply to them, fairly protect them, actually, which is the aim of what it would be meant to do. So I think you have all of those, and then, you know, going into sort of pure strict verification, in terms of ID verification, you have the same kind of equities problems there, in terms of widening that digital divide, which I think are all the reasons, you know, behind the e-Safety Commissioner's cautious approach to begin with, which I think is, you know, rightly cautious. And I think it is, back to Peter's point, parents are sometimes willing to abdicate responsibility, and sometimes just really scared because they don't know what to do and the job is extremely hard. And so jumping to a solution like banning under 16s from social media is not only problematic, I think, for that parenting-child relationship and the kid's ability, but it's also problematic in that it paints social media as the reason for many of the ills or the problems that youth are dealing with at the moment in terms of the mental health crisis and other issues. And the evidence of causality is just not there, despite recent popular books and releases and the big push of campaigns. The science is not there yet, and we need to be careful, because otherwise we'll take, you know, government resources away from where they need to be spent to be helping youth.
Interesting point about the science not being there. I mean, I think there has been a accepted wisdom that the uptick in mental health problems has been, at least, you know, it seems just correlated with increased social media usage rather than a causation. Interesting. Sorry, did someone else have?
Well, I'll be interested in speaking if I'm not interrupting over somebody else. Yeah, I mean, I just want to endorse a lot of what Amber just said. I actually think the roadmap that the E-Safety Commissioner put out is worth reading for anyone who's interested in this topic. And again, I'd like to compliment her on that, because she does identify how some of the research around this is at times in conflict and even contradictory. And the whole document is quite is not as perhaps forthright as then is claimed in the political arena, or somehow that kind of proposal is used for political purposes. So, you know, the proposal was for a pilot program. I think there will be real difficulties in making this work. It's hugely problematic in terms of the interference and the imposition that it imposes on all users in order to access the internet. I mean, I do also think the other comments that were recently made by the Safety Commissioner's Office is about how it's very difficult to separate out social media from other forms of media as a potential cause of for mental health among young people, but generally other harms that might arise. And so there is this real difficulty, I think, in exploring the reality, or the exploring in any measured way the utility of a proposal like this in such a hotly contested political environment. And I think we do have to be very cautious. The moment the technology is not up to scratch in terms of either delivering on what it says it will do, but also in limiting then the impact upon others. And there is this perennial problem that the Safety Commissioner confronted in relation to X, but also in this instance of the use of VPNs. And I don't think anybody is proposing somehow to ban the use of VPNs, but the idea that young people won't be able to find ways, if they want to circumvent this technology, I think is silly. And then we have to think, what are the consequences then of imposing a regime like this if people are then pushed to use other kinds of websites that might not have the age verification imposed upon them, that may be in fact worse for young people to be accessing. And lastly, I think it is worth looking at some of the research that does exist. And again, eSafety's called for more research, and I think this is the right approach, which looks at what young people want, reiterating on what Amber was saying. And this is one thing we put in our submission, that if you actually talk to young people, particularly about accessing online pornography, what they want is not restrictions, but an open discussion about it, about how to navigate this environment. And, you know, comprehensive sex and relationships education, I think, has a very important role to play here. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Now, we're kind of coming up against the end of our session today, but I want to give everyone a chance to give us their final thoughts. Anything that hasn't been said yet, anything that that you think has been left out. I might just throw in reverse order from what we started. So starting with Hayden there, if there was anything to wrap up the conversation or anything else you wanted to add there, that'd be great.
Thanks, Mike. I don't have a lot to add. I guess it's interesting listening to these conversations, and from a law enforcement perspective, we're always behind the eight ball as technology advances and our offenders utilising that technology. And one of the things we always try to work into is the unknown. And when we hear we put in these concerted efforts into education and into getting our young people to communicate and open up, communicate with parents and their peers, and then, you know, hearing the potential for an age ban, it concerns, certainly from us, or from my perspective anyway, that we'd be removing that communication ability. That's how that network that they have. And that just adds, I guess, to another thread of technical advancements as we talk about the unknown of and the impact of end-to-end encryption and certainly AI gen. So this is great. I think we need more of these sorts of conversations, and it's been great to be part of it. And I look forward to the next one.
Thanks, Hayden. And yeah, that the technology piece on Gen AI and it was touched on other critical technologies, including quantum, but a whole range of things that are coming that are really going to rapidly change the landscape. It's a little bit scary. But and speaking of, I think it was Dr. Lloyd Jones who mentioned some of those other critical technologies.
Yes, I did. They occupy my day job. So my closing, I guess, observations, just from what we've discussed and the things that I think about a lot and look into a lot, really coming back to resilience. I think resilience is a really important conceptual tool that can be applied in these contexts, and getting away from the fear-based responses, and approaches, because usually they're knee-jerk, whereas resilience is actually long-term. It takes a long view, and it looks to, how can we, stabilize, regenerate, all those things which are important. And it applies in this environment because young people, they will grow up into adults and their world will be technology. And I was reflecting the other day, that the quantum generation is coming. They're all sort of, in primary school now, but when they're in high school and young adults, they'll have new technologies. So that's that first thing. The second thing goes to something that Lizzie raised, which is about transparency within the government, industry, cooperative networks and forums where regulatory decisions are made. And I think that there's not enough transparency over that. And it happens elsewhere because industry and government do partner. They partner in critical infrastructure, they partner in different places. And I think we've got to come up with a better way to get transparency so that we know how regulatory decisions are made and why outcomes of the outcomes. And as Lizzie said, civil society doesn't always get invited, and it also doesn't have the time to be in those conversations, and that's got to get better, because it is that bigger effort. That's enough. Thank you.
At the same
Enjoyed
time,
the conversation.
At the same time, nowhere near enough. There's so much more to talk about. Amber.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just pick up on a couple of things. One, I just want to end by saying we need to hurry up with the Privacy Act reform and the Children's Online Privacy Code. I think that we don't give enough credence to how much this will impact and improve children's safety overall, actually. And so I'm looking forward to that happening. And hopefully based on what Susan was saying is that perhaps in the creation of that, there can be a start to more conversation between industry, civil society, and in that process as well, and to understanding how things play out, how things might impact kids. The other thing, just sort of leveraging off that point about emerging technologies. And maybe I'm just putting this out there for future discussions the next time we have one of these, which is immersive technologies. And I do think that we need to have some critical discussions around this kind of technology and its impact on children in particular. It'll have impacts, they have impacts obviously on adults as well, but it will be really interesting to think about what that means with companies increasingly marketing these products as presence and embodiment. And so if we're embodied in these spaces that these companies as private entities are creating, and they want us to be present and embodied in these places, how much does that become more like walking into a shopping mall? More like, shopping around and going into different shops, and how much more then does that sort of, to be prepared for that, thinking more around the types of legal and regulatory frameworks that actually regulate our participation in those kind of spaces, because these are going to be really critical, and there's already evidence of I think more so than social media or anything like that, we actually have some indications of the impact of trauma through immersive technologies, and the impact of those kind of experiences and sort of half embodiment, living through half embodiment online. So let's look at that before it gets the better of us. You're muted, Mike.
I was going to say, literally in the metaverse, you are half embodied. You don't have any legs. So
literally.
Lizzie.
Well, I mean, I suppose I'll finish where I started. I am grateful for the opportunity to have this kind of interdisciplinary discussion about this topic, because I think that is the way forward. And these conversations do keep me returning to the question of what we mean by online safety. And there's a particular role to play for legislative interventions that facilitate the work of someone like Hayden, which is quite specific. And, you know, as a criminal justice matter, or how we manage that kind of system of investigation and offenders and the like, you know, there's a whole legal kind of framework that we can use and make use of, and precedents and the like, to manage that and put in appropriate safeguards, which I think is critically important. And then there's larger scale regulatory interventions around making online ecosystems kind of safe places for young people, but I think hopefully for all people. And I think that's where sometimes there can be some concerns around overreach and associated lack of transparency for regulators. But where I keep returning to as a human rights advocate who's a close observer of both government bad behaviour but also industry bad behaviour is that I do think we do need to look at regulatory interventions that target the business model, because data-centric, data-extractive business models that profit from micro-targeting, virality, keeping people on device, these are things that do make our online spaces unsafe, not just because it's harmful to be on these places for a long period of time, especially when you're fed content which is unpleasant or, you know, whatever, harmful, but also because it impacts our information ecosystem, harms our democracy, mis and disinformation. So I think if we're going to engage in regulatory interventions around that ecosystem question, ones that target the business model and give people the capacity to resist the shaping of their online lives by large private entities that don't necessarily have their best interests at heart, that I think is the best way to make sure the legislative interventions are effective, but also appropriately limited and focus on empowerment rather than treating people, you know, as a subjects upon which we impose an agenda, which is, you know, the antithesis of a human rights approach, which treats people as having inherent dignity and interest in shaping their own future and the right to be taken seriously and to have a say in how their lives take shape.
Thank you so much, Lizzie. And Peter.
Look, I can really ride off the back of the preceding speakers, and I agree with most of what they've said. I just default to two last points. One is that one of the problems of policy making in this area is that we are in the areas of, amongst other things, law enforcement and information security, including national security. And the default always of government and policymakers when you get near those areas is to close down transparency. And so I really wanted to pick up Suzanne's point around the need for transparency in this space. And then to echo again Suzanne's point around resilience, you can't build resilient human beings without giving them exposure to risk over time and giving them the tools to evaluate and deal with that risk. And so I'm really opposed to the concept of age bans and in favour of ways that we can increase the resilience whilst also picking up Lizzie's point, not giving the service providers a free pass by saying it's all about the user. So there's many balances we have to get right here, but really echoing the points around transparency, resilience, and the need to get the balance right. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you very much. And I'll just wrap up very quickly, but then throw to Amy to finalise. My only point would be that not to take away from the seriousness of the issues, the urgency of the issues, but taking a bit of a positive view, I guess, is that there is so much work being done in this space, and it's a relatively new problem. It's really only been around for about 15 years, maybe 20 years. The iPhone only came out in 2007. So when we're thinking about these rapidly moving technological issues and how it's shaping society, we can take a little bit of a positive view and look at the side of how much work has been done. And of course, it's never enough whenever there's harm, but there is so much being done, and I think we're moving in the right direction in terms of having more focused discussions around how the different players in the ecosystem appropriately take up their responsibilities. So that's my view. But thank you everyone for participating today, and I'll just throw to Amy from the Future of Privacy Forum.
Right. Just briefly, I want to say a quick thank you, a special thank you to our friends at ASPE, to Mike, to Bart. It has been really a pleasure to work with you. Mike, you are an excellent moderator. I will try not to emulate you too hard, but this has been a great conversation. You mastered it. Thank you to all of our speakers, your expertise and experiences, and your willingness to bring them to this conversation. It educated me quite a lot. I greatly appreciate it. And I'm always honored to hear from all of you. Thank you to everybody who attended. It has been FPF's great honor to co-host this conversation. And several of you in your closing remarks mentioned the next conversation. So it also is an honor to preview that FPF will be working on plans to continue this conversation in a series of events throughout 2024, which is the year we are in person in major cities around Australia. And so we will be sharing that information with those who registered for this event and our networks in Australia and in that region. Please stay tuned. Thank you one more time. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. And I greatly appreciate all of you.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
Thank you.